So this is the Fujifilm XF 10 to 24mm f4 ultra wide angle zoom lens, and it's one of Fuji's oldest zoom lenses. It came out around about the same time that they launched the X series system. So why am I talking about it? Why am I reviewing it? Well, that's because one of the questions that I get asked most often is from people who've just moved to the X series system and they're doing landscape photography, and they basically say to me, which lens should I get? And this is always the lens that I recommend for landscape photography. It's the first lens that I bought when I switched to the system, along with the 55 to 200 telephoto, which I've also made a video about. So what is it about this that makes it such an essential landscape photography lens? Well, the first thing is that if you're anything like me and you like those great epic views with a foreground that makes you feel like you can step right into the image, then you're going to love images that are made with a wide angle lens. Now, it's not the only wide angle lens that Fuji make. When I got this, they also had the 16mm prime and the 14mm prime, both of which are faster than this. They have a wider aperture. This widest aperture is the f4. The 14mm I think is f2.8 and the 16 is 1.6, so they let more light in. But the problem with those lenses is they're excellent lenses. They're super sharp and the image quality is exceptionally good. But the thing about 16mm or 14mm is, for me, they're really just not quite wide enough to get the kind of wide angle shots that I like, because I often like to work with something in the foreground, whether that's rocks or flowers or whatever element that I can find, because that gives it the foreground an anchor, it gives it a balance. And then you've got the midground. Usually you've got the focal point at the back, which can be some kind of mountains or something like that. And then hopefully you're shooting where there's going to be a really nice sky or good light or something like that. And to fit all that in without it feeling cramped really requires something that's wider than 16 or wider than 14. I often find when I'm shooting with those kind of focal lengths, everything's a little bit cramped. The mountains maybe are a little bit too close to the top of the lens, or I can't give enough space around the foreground to let it breathe. And I just find that the 16mm in particular, and 14mm lesser, it's just really not quite wide enough to give me the kind of space around everything that I want in the frame. So for me, while those lenses are really good options and very sharp, they're not quite wide enough. And the 10 to 24 is just such a lovely option. When I used to shoot with a full frame, I used 17 to 35 and then 16 to 35, and it's just a focal range that I find really useful. At the 10mm end, at the wide end, you've got that kind of shots that I was talking about, but also you can go all the way through to the other end, to the 24mm end, which gives you a very different viewpoint to the one that you get at 10mm. It's a focal length that I use a lot for if I'm shooting street portraits and things like that, so I find that I can use the same lens for doing both of that kind of work. Now, since I bought this, Fuji have also released the 8 to 16 f2.8, which I reviewed earlier this year. And that's a fantastic lens. It's really sharp. It's f2.8, which makes it great if you're shooting things like the stars or if you're shooting auroras. My problems with that lens, and why I think this is a much better landscape lens than that, are a couple. First of all, it's a very big and heavy lens, and one of the reasons why I switched to the X system is because I wanted to travel as fast and light as possible. So it's a big, bulky, heavy lens. Also, while there are filter systems that work with the 8 to 16, they're really big filter systems. They require you to fit a whole filter system around the lens hood, the lens petal. So you're carrying bigger, bulkier filters than you normally would, and it doesn't accept screw-in filters. And the other thing about the 8 to 16 lens is that it doesn't have the variety of this. You get an extra 2mm at the wide end, which gives you a little bit, but not really that much, but you lose a lot at the other end. It only goes to 16, which is still very wide angle. You lose all of that from 16 to 24, which this lens have, which I find means that I'm changing lenses a lot less often. I tend to travel only with two lenses, with the 10 to 24 and with the 55 to 200, because I really don't shoot very often in the mid-range. Carrying something like the 8 to 16 really demands that you then have a mid-range zoom, something like the 16 to 55 or the 16 to 80 or the 18 to 55, and then also a telephoto. So it means for me that I'm going to be carrying three lenses. This lens, the focal length on this, the focal range on this, gives me enough variety for it to be just a great all-round lens. Now, as you can see, it's not a particularly big lens. You can hold it quite easily in one hand. It's 87mm long, and it is 410 grams. So it's not particularly heavy. If you compare that with the 8 to 16, it's a much bigger, heavier lens. This actually feels quite light. It feels relatively small. It feels quite a compact lens. but the build quality is excellent. It's mostly metal. I've been using this for 4 years and it has been with me on a lot of trips. Now, Fuji don't class this as weather sealed. It doesn't actually have any weather sealing, and I do get asked about that a lot. You know, how do I feel about using this lens along with something like the X-T3 or the X-T2, which are weather sealed? And I've never once really felt that I've had to compromise or worried that this lens isn't going to be able to deal with the weather. Now, as I say, I've used this a lot. I've probably used it on something like 20 trips. It's been used in dusty environments and waterfalls in Indonesia. It's been with me to the Azores in the Atlantic, where it got rained on pretty much every day. It's been to Iceland, I think 3 or 4 times, where it's been exposed to a lot of dust in the highlands, or it's been exposed to a lot of waterfall spray. It's been with me to Lofoten in the snow in sub-zero temperatures, where it's dealt with extreme cold and lots of snow on it. It's been there 3 times. I've taken it to the mountains, to the Dolomites, 4 or 5 times, where it's been rained on. I've been there in the winter and it's been snow. I was using it down to about minus 20 degrees. It's been with me to the Faroe Islands. It's been with me to Tuscany multiple times, where it's got very dusty. And where I live here in Portugal, we're right next to the Atlantic coast, and I've used it loads of times next to the sea, where it's been getting salty spray on it. And after 4 years, it still functions really well. If it were going to be showing any kind of adverse effects from that kind of exposure to the weather and conditions, I'd be noticing them by now, and it isn't at all. I mean, you can see when you look around, it's quite chipped. I don't tend to baby my stuff. It's been banged and dinged quite a few times, but it still works perfectly well, and I don't have any concerns at all about the fact that this isn't classed as a weather sealed lens. I'm happy to use it whatever the weather. Now, as I said, it's a relatively small lens, and I find it balances particularly well on something like the X-T2 or the X-T3. There's a really nice balance. The way it feels in the hand, it's very easy to operate. There's a good natural weight between the two cameras. With a smaller camera, something like the X-T20 or the X-T30, which I use as my backup camera, I don't think it balances quite so well. It's not bad, it's just they're smaller cameras and the smaller grip. With the weight of the lens at the front, you're basically always pulling back a little bit on the camera, and it balances fine. I just feel that this lens is really made for something like the X-T2 or the X-T3. It really fits well on a camera like that, or the X-H1. Something like the X Pro cameras, the X Pro 2 or the new X Pro 3, not so much. I always feel that camera is designed much more for primes, because if you use something like this on it, you're going to not be able to use the optical viewfinder. It really does feel like it's made better for the XT series. Now, all the rings are really solid. You've got the focus ring here, you've got the zoom ring behind that, and as you can see, it's completely internal zoom, so when you zoom, the barrel doesn't extend at all, and neither does it rotate. So if you've got a polarizer on the front, it's not going to rotate the polarizer. And then behind that, you've got the aperture ring, which does click. It doesn't stop. It doesn't just stop from one end of the aperture to the other. It's a free turning aperture ring, and it's not marked. The aperture isn't marked on the outside of the lens. I know some people don't like that. They like to be able to look at the top of the lens and see what aperture they're using. But with this lens, you have to look at the display on the back of the camera. One thing that is worth noting, I don't know if you can see, is I've got black tape on the front of the lens, because the front of the lens has a lot of white writing on it. Because of the nature of the front element, what I found when I first started using this is that with certain filter systems, when you had the filter on the front, what would happen is the writing here would reflect off the back of the filter and then back into the lens, and you'd see it kind of in the image, and particularly if you were shooting something like a reflection or stuff like that, where there was very still water. So the writing would be reflected kind of backwards and upside down onto the image, which was then really, really tricky to remove in Photoshop. So all I've done is just put black tape around the front there. It's not permanent. If I ever want to sell this lens, or which I doubt I ever will, I can just take the tape off. You could also cover it with black matte paint or something like that, but black tape works really fine. While I'm speaking about filters, it is a 72 millimeter filter ring diameter. So something like the Lee 7.5 filter system, which is 75 millimeters across, is going to vignette. Because if you think about it, if this is 72 millimeters and the 7.5 system is 75 millimeters, it only gives you 3 millimeters or 1.5 millimeter clearance on either side of the lens. So that's gonna vignette. I can't say specifically because it's a long time since I've used it, since I've tried to use it, but pretty much at anything I would guess below 14 or 16 millimeters, you're going to be able to start to see the corner of the filter system in there. You can use 100mm filters on this, fine, don't have any problem with that. I use circular filters, and I found that I can quite easily get 2 circular filters screwed in here without any vignetting, and it is very rare that I ever need to use more than 2 filters on an image. I've tried using the Manfrotto Zoom system, where you screw a magnetic filter connector here and then your circular filters just click on. It does vignette. It vignettes at anything below about 14 or 15 millimeters, even with 1 filter. So that's not something that really works for me. I just stick with the circular filters. Now, just a few other things before we look at the image quality. It is an f4 lens, fixed f4, so it's the same aperture all the way through the zoom range, which means it's not particularly fast. This isn't a great lens if you want to be shooting stars or if you want to be shooting auroras or things like that. You're better off with something like the Fuji 16 or the 14, although I don't find those wide enough to shoot things like the stars or the auroras, because with those kind of shots, you usually want to get as much sky as possible. So I use third-party lenses like the Laowa 9mm or the Rockinon 12mm. They're really small, and I just take them with me if I think I'm going to be going to a place where I'm going to be shooting the night sky. But for most landscapes, f4 really isn't a problem. You're going to be shooting most of your landscapes at something like f7.1, from f7.1 up to about f16. It has quite a good close focusing distance. It's from about 25 centimeters in front of the lens, so you can use it to get relatively close to foregrounds. And one final thing about the lens is that it is OIS. It is optically stabilized. It's one of Fuji's earlier lenses, so the optical stabilization isn't as strong on the more recent lenses. I really don't know how many stops it's graded for. I usually use this on a tripod, so optical image stabilization is something that I've usually got turned off. It's not something that's particularly important for me. But I do occasionally shoot landscape images handheld, and I have been able to shoot this at something down to around about 1/4 of a second. Now, if we bear in mind that the kind of ratio that we normally talk about when we're shooting handheld is that your shutter speed should be double your focal length. So if you're shooting at 10mm, you really need a shutter speed of about 1/20th of something like that. The fact that I can get a quarter of a second out of it means that for me, that works out at about 2.5 stops. Stabilization, which isn't particularly bad, but as I say, I don't really use that much, and it's not something that I can speak with any great authority on. So let's have a look at the image quality and sharpness of this lens and how it performs. Now, this is not in any way, shape or form going to be a technical review. If you're interested in mathematical resolution charts about the performance of this, there are loads of them on the internet, but that's not really what I'm going to do, because that's not really what I care about with lenses. Really, my only interest is that I can get acceptably sharp, very sharp images with a lens that I can use for commercial purposes, that it's sharp in the center, that it's sharp in the borders, and that it's sharp in the corners, and that I don't have noticeably soft parts of the image. And overall, I found this lens to be extremely sharp. Not as sharp as some of the other lenses in the Fuji lineup, things like the 16mm or the 8-16 lens, but certainly sharp enough for what I need it for. Okay, so let's have a look at how well you can expect this lens to perform in terms of sharpness. Now, as I said, it's definitely not a technical review. I'm just going to be looking at acceptable levels of sharpness in my landscape images. I'm using Capture One, and I'm going to be looking at unedited raw images. Now, I use both Lightroom and Capture One, depending on whichever one works best for what I'm doing at the time, but I do find that Capture One renders detail better than Lightroom does. So this is going to show the images at their best quality sharpness, if you like. So if we zoom in here, this is an image taken earlier last month in Trecin. It's at 10mm, so at the widest end of the focal length, and it's at f8, which is where I try to shoot most of my landscape images. So let's just put that in full screen and have a look. And you can see that the very center on the rocks of the Trecin itself, it's certainly acceptably sharp. Looking at the detail in the rocks, it's very crisp. You can just make out the signs there. On the left here, you can see it certainly does get softer. As soon as we move away from the center here, around the Cadena de Misurina peaks, that is a lot softer. If we go over to the other side, it's a similar story, but there is actually quite a little bit of haze there, so that's interrupting some of the sharpness. But if we go down into the bottom, you can see the foreground here. Again, it's not as sharp as the center, but it's certainly sharp enough if we look at the detail around these rocks coming up on the side of this slope. I would say that is definitely acceptably sharp for my landscape images. Again, a little bit softer in the border there and a little bit softer in the border down here. But again, just looking at this, it's actually not as soft in this corner as it is in the other corner. And if we look at the Refugio Lavradero down here, it's actually relatively sharp. So let's have a look at another image. This one is also, I believe, a 10mm. Let's just have a look. This is taken at f6.4. So again, it's right at the beginning of where you would expect the lens to perform at its in the most detail. Let's just zoom in a little bit. And again, right in the center, you can see there's really a lot of detail there. These are some of the workshop participants. If we go into the corner here, you can see it's certainly acceptably sharp around the grass, the detail around the boots there, and the detail in the rocks. Now this is a handheld shot. I was just shooting some of the workshop participants, so it's probably not as steady as it would be on a tripod. And let's just have a look at the shutter time. It's 1/75th, so there really shouldn't be any shake at all there at 10mm. So I don't think the fact that it's handheld is going to make a difference. But if we go into the bottom left here, again, you can see that's not bad actually. It's certainly not as sharp as the center, but considering how close the camera is to the ground there, we're right at the edge of its of the depth of field. It is getting softer, but for me that's plenty enough detail in the grass. When we look at it in 100%, actually that's at 200%, so it's going to be distorting a little bit. That's at 100%. That for me is certainly sharp enough. Now, I don't tend to take many images with the aperture wide open. It's just, for landscape shooting, it's just not something that I tend to do. I'm really not sure why Capture One has saturated this image quite so much. It's probably going by default to the film setting that the camera set on, which looks like it's the Velvia. But anyway, let's have a look. Really, I just want to have a look at sharpness here, because this is shot at f4, so it's with the lens wide open. Again, we're at 10mm, I think, 13.2. But if we zoom in and just have a look at the detail in the flower here, so this is wide open in the center. Again, that is certainly plenty sharp enough for my uses. When we go over to the edge, we're at the edge of the depth of field here, and we're getting into the border. But the center where the flower is focused, that's certainly sharp enough. Now this is an image taken at the other end of the aperture. So this is an f22. Again, I very rarely shoot at f22 because you would expect there to be some softness due to diffraction. But here I was trying to get the sun star, so I was closing down the aperture as much as I could to try to get the sun star as it went behind the cypress there. And you can see it's definitely unedited because there's some dust spots on the sensor. But let's have a look at the detail in the grass just to see at f22 what differences we can expect due to diffraction. And it's certainly softer here. I mean, I would say this is just about acceptably sharp. I think processing it, I could certainly bring out more detail with the clarity slide and with the sharpening, but you can see over here, even in the center, this image is really not as sharp as we were seeing the lens performing at f13 and at f8. So what about at the other end of the focal length? So this is an image taken at f24. Let's just check the aperture there. So this is at f10. So this is where I would expect the lens to be performing at its best. So you can see in the center the detail here and the detail around these peaks is really good. I generally don't feel that the lens is quite as sharp at 24mm as it is at 10mm. It's better as a wide angle than it is as we get towards the middle end of the zoom. Although it does seem to perform better in the borders, on the right border at 24 than it does at 10. So make of that as you will. But I think the sharpest part of the image here in the center, which is certainly acceptably sharp, is still not as sharp as the center of the image at 10mm. But you can see as we go down here, this is an image with lots of detail. You can see the path coming up there and in these rocks. Again, I think sharpness is a subjective thing. I think people, what people find acceptable is different. For me, this is certainly acceptably sharp. You can see, I think there's some people there, some signs. Yeah, there's a group of photographers over here who look like they're going to be shooting the side of the Trecim as the sun goes down. So let's just have another look at another image that is taken wide open. I couldn't find another image at f4, so this one is taken at f4.5. It's kind of in the middle of the zoom range. It's at 16.6, so it's right in the middle, but let's just zoom in to see the detail on this peak, because the image that I looked at previously was the flower, so I was deliberately dropping the background out of focus. This is much more of a landscape image where detail through the entire through the entire image is much more important here. And I was shooting this with the aperture wide open because it was handheld. The light was relatively low, so I opened the aperture up. And you can see the detail here is very good for an f4.5 image. Even with, this is the center, if we go into the border here, it's not as sharp. But again, I've noticed, as I said, the softness seems to appear on the right side more at 10mm. As we go back through the focal length, it actually does seem to get a little bit sharper on the right hand side, because I certainly find the detail over here to be good enough for what I would need it for. Also, I think you notice as I go through the images that the lens is nice and contrasty. It's quite punchy. It produces plenty of detail. I don't have any problem at all with chromatic aberration. It's something that I've never felt that I need to correct it. I barely notice it. And I think pretty much across all of the focal length, the lens performs extremely well. It's not the sharpest lens that Fuji make, but it's certainly sharp enough for what I need it for. And I think that's pretty much it for this lens. So as you can no doubt tell, I think this is an excellent lens. It's a brilliant lens. And if you are using the Fuji system and you're looking for a landscape lens, then this is one that I would highly recommend. The proof is in the pudding. I've been using this lens myself for 4 years. I've used it in so many different places. I would say that something like 60% of all the images that I've taken over the last 4 years have probably been done with this lens. It is a lovely size. It's certainly small and portable enough to carry around with you easily. It's tough enough and sturdy enough for me to not worry about exposing it to any different kinds of weather conditions. And it is sharp enough to give you extremely good image quality, and certainly good enough for my own needs. And just before I go, I'd like to thank Squarespace for sponsoring this video, and by doing so, helping me to be able to produce content for this channel and to maintain this channel. Now, I use Squarespace. I use Squarespace websites for the foundation of my business, which is my website. And since I've been using them, I've been really impressed and really happy with just how good they are. I'm really terrible, not techie at all, and producing websites and things like that is something really quite challenging for me. I've got no idea whatsoever about coding, but Squarespace is so easy and intuitive to use. I found it really easy to not only to create my website, but then to be able to adapt it and cater it and make it look personal to exactly how I want it to look, and to be able to better present my images and my photography business on there. So if you're looking at building your own website, I can highly recommend using Squarespace. You can get a free trial, and if you follow the link that I'll put in the description below, www.squarespace.com/AndyMumford, you can use Andy Mumford as a coupon code and get a 10% discount if at the end of the trial you're happy and you decide to start using Squarespace for your own website. So as always, thank you so much for watching, and thank you so much for supporting the channel. It's genuinely appreciated. If you've got any comments or any questions, please drop them in the box below, and I will really try my best to get back to you. And once again, have a great weekend and take care.